Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Charles Mills, who's the John Evans Professor of Moral and Intellectual Philosophy at Northwestern University. He has written 5 books, including The Racial Contract, Blackness Visible, Essays on Philosophy and Race, and most recently, Radical Theory, Caribbean Reality, Race, Class, and Social Domination. He's going to speak today on body politic, bodies impolitic. Thank you.
As a philosopher, you're somewhat handicapped, somewhat out of place at a conference on the body, because everybody knows that philosophers are non-corporeal beings, or at least aspire to that status. From the Platonic tradition onwards, the idea is, the body is what holds you back, it keeps you down, it's full of these nasty appetites, you need to be a sort of clear-headed guy. So there's a kind of 12-step program by which, by the time you're 55 or 60 on the verge of retirement or something, you can sort of, climb your way upwards to the world of the forms, away from the body. Anyway, so I'm handicapped, just to begin with, but I'm going to see what I can do. So, as the title of my paper implies, I'm looking at the relationship between the body politic and the bodies under its control and supervision through these sort of central metaphors of Western political philosophy, the idea of a body politic. And metaphors, they're not just, sort of frills. There's a lot of work been done by philosophers on metaphors, and it's been suggested that these figures are actually pretty central to how we see the world, how we understand the world, and of course, crucial in addition, how we misunderstand the world. So the picture I want to call up for you, for those of you who have read it, which I hope should be most people, is a famous frontispiece illustration for Hobbes' Leviathan. Because in this image, and apparently the artist got feedback from Hobbes when he was putting it together, the polity is represented as a giant figure, a man, of course, a monarch, that is itself composed of other men. So it brings home to us the crucial fact that the body politic is itself made up of multitudinous subordinate bodies, and in the opening pages of the book, Hobbes even extends the metaphor further. He analyzes the various personnel of the state, the functions of the polity, and he analogizes them to the functions of the body. So we have the nerves, we have the sinews, we have the muscles, we have the eyes, we have the ears, the brain, and so forth. But we hear somewhat less about what could be called maybe the less respectable bodily functions. We need to know, for example, about the lower intestine. What about the urinogenitary tract? What about the anus? Who's doing the shit work? These are some of the questions that we also need to ask ourselves. So if you're given a sort of mapping of various functions, then who's in charge of excretion, who's in charge of waste disposal, and maybe even more to the point, who represent the alien bodies within the body politic who perhaps you put up with for a time, but who really need to be expelled from the body. Now Hobbes, as I say, he has these metaphors and these natural functions, but he's emphatic that the polity is not itself natural. And this, of course, is one of the crucial insights that represents the break that modernity makes with the world of antiquity and the world of feudalism. The polity is an artificial construct. So this mighty Leviathan, we're to see it as a giant artificial man. And the question we need to ask ourselves, picking up from this emphasis by Hobbes on artificiality, is the extent to which the corporeality of the macro body and the corporeality of the bodies that compose it is itself a social logic which is then naturalized. So we need to sort of be alert to the functions by which a natural discourse is itself, in fact, social and political through and through. So that's a sort of starting point in a standard Western philosophy, Hobbes, what more respectable than that? Okay, here's the non-respectable part. In the particular context of the United States, this macro body, Leviathan, it's a racial body. Okay, it's a racial state, and the artificial person is a white person, specifically a white male. So we need to understand these social roles, these political functions, these naturalized ones, in the context of white supremacy. We need to understand that this is sort of an overarching category, not just of this polity, but of other ones, but certainly of this one. And it means that the national imaginaries, the national iconographies, views of state personnel and legal rulings and immigration law and aesthetic and moral norms, they're all going to be, and they have historically been shaped by race. And the language of health and disease, of fitness and unfitness, of purity and impurity, eugenics and dysgenics, racial hygiene and racial pollution have been central to the political history of the United States. So that in 1790, Congress passes a naturalization bill, and it specifies that a prerequisite for becoming a naturalized U.S. citizen is being white. And Matthew Fry Jacobs, an excellent book, Whiteness of a Different Color, all kinds of interesting and great stuff in it. But he has this great line that's really worth quoting. He says, a citizen, a U.S. citizen is basically someone who can help defend against Indian attacks and put down a slave uprising. So what it is to be a citizen is basically racialized from the start, and the whole apparatus that's imported across the Atlantic from the liberal tradition, from Europe, all these concepts, all these ways of dividing things up, they're racialized from the start. And self-government, the capacity for self-government, basically has racial prerequisites. And this is why it becomes possible in the founding documents of this polity for Jefferson to write in the Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, while simultaneously being a slave owner. So the question then becomes, how do you conceptualize such a polity given existing theoretical bodies? And I'm referring back as one of these gray-haired guys on the stage. As some gray-haired guys on the stage, not everybody. As time goes by, you find, you're increasing the older person in the room, which is kind of scary. Anyway, so in a pre-postmodernist epoch, you can see how long I've been around. You basically had two major bodies of thought. So there's the dominant liberal tradition, and of course, its various incarnations. And this is a time period, so long ago when Marxism was still alive. So the question then is, how do you try to relate this vision of the polity to these existing bodies of theory? And the problem you find is that neither of them provides an adequate conceptualization. In Marxism, which I'll call white Marxism, the polity is basically seen as a class state, as capitalism. So race, insofar as it's taken account of, it's seen as ideal. It's seen as superstructural. It's seen as a particular manifestation of bourgeois ideology. And there's a tendency towards class reductionism, by which race is reduced to class or to an ideology imposed from above on the workers, against their interests, supposedly. And then in the liberal tradition, you're seeing the U.S. as basically an egalitarian liberal democracy. And Roger Smith's book, Civic Ideals, and there's an excellent book on this because he points out the extent to which even leading theorists of American political culture, and he instances Alexis de Tocqueville, Louis Hartz, Gunnar Myrdal, and even when they talk about race, they frame the U.S. as an egalitarian liberal democracy. So racism and sexism, insofar as they exist, they're basically anomalies. So in the Marxist tradition, race is ideology, it's superstructure. In the liberal tradition, it's individual psychological deficiency. So in both cases, in a sense, race as political structure, race as social ontology, race disappears. And what we need to do, what I've tried to suggest in my own work, is that we need to see race as political, we need to see race as social structural, we need to see race as material, and we need to see race as corporeal, though not, of course, a physical corporeality, but as I said in the opening point, a corporeality that is a socialized one. So from this perspective, and here I'm drawing on a long tradition that goes back, of course, to the oppositional black tradition. You're seeing race as central to the polity, but you're claiming that we need to understand it, not in biological terms, but in socially constructed terms. And once you've done that, it then means that the categories and the typical discussions of mainstream political theory, you're going to see how they're racialized. So consider, for example, one of the topics on the opening questions, rape and sexual violence. From this perspective, what counts as rape in the first place, what counts as sexual violence will be shaped by race. And a lot of work has been done on this by black feminists, by other feminists of color. When black women are slaves, they're property, so in that sense they could not be raped. You can't rape your own property. So here, the sort of functional purpose that's being served for the polity, the racial patriarchal polity, is the reproduction of the slave population. In other words, you need the slave population to multiply, so black women then are basically sort of breeders in this role. In the postbellum period, when slavery has been abolished, it's still the case that black women are unrapeable, now because they're basically represented as naturally promiscuous. So it then means that, as Kimberly Crenshaw has pointed out, that the idea of a respectable Negro woman is a contradiction in terms. These women cannot be raped again. So sexual violence is only seen as sexual violence when certain kinds of women are the targets of sexual violence. You get a set of norms around sexual violence which operate in such a way that certain women are basically not seen as targets because whatever happens to them will not be categorized as sexual violence. And another point that's sort of important for this is that some feminists have argued, some black feminists have argued that whereas in the postbellum period, we see lynching as a sort of classic expression of the act of violence which keeps the system of Jim Crow in place, some black feminists have argued that the rape of black women was far more prevalent. In other words, the number of women raped was far greater than the number of blacks killed, so that in terms of an act of violence, sort of keep the system in place, the rape of black women needs far more attention in terms of understanding how this system, this racial polity, the sort of racial patriarchy is kept in place. It also affects, of course, matters of reproductive rights. In the case of black women, it was forced reproduction, whether they wanted to or not, they were going to have children, and of course the theme of Toni Morrison's Beloved is precisely the fact that you do not want to bring a child into this kind of world. But this changes, and this is a manifestation of the fact that the logic, the racial logic, is not a natural logic, it's not a biologic, it's a social logic. So that in the postbellum period, blacks who are no longer as functional as they were under slavery, blacks become to be seen as a dysfunctional population, as a pollution in the polity. And you then have, in the post-war period, discussions, well, what can we do with this black population? There was, in fact, a hope in some quarters that, once, you have the abolition of slavery, blacks are going to die out because they've been sort of, maintained so well by their white masters, not going to function on their own. And there was a sort of hopeful thought that the black population would vanish altogether. Alas, this did not happen, so we then have the problem of getting rid of this population. So we then have discussions, the American Colonization Society, let's, send blacks to Africa, let's send them to the Caribbean or whatever. And then the eugenics movement, of course, late 19th century, early 20th century, sterilization of the unfit. It then means that among those who are sterilized, women of color are disproportionately represented because the idea is this is not a population you want multiplying. This is a population which is basically inimical to the health of the polity. Similarly, in terms of overall patterns of reproduction, anti-miscegenation law becomes crucial to United States legislation. The idea being that you want racial purity to be some overarching ideal. It's not the case that you want in the bloodstream of the nation being polluted by these alien elements. And think of it that it's as recently as 1967. It's only in 1967 with the Supreme Court Loving versus Virginia decision that anti-miscegenation law is deemed unconstitutional. Until then, I think in 67 there was still about 16 states still had such laws on the books. Another implication of this is that perceptions of the family connections are severed. Entire branches of the family are disavowed because these are the branches you don't want to admit. And a great example is the Thomas Jefferson Association, the sort of legitimate white association, and the other hand, the sort of long-existing black association from the Sally Hemings line, and sort of no contact between them because the white association refused to admit until DNA testing showed it was undeniable that they also were part of the Jefferson family. There's also the phenomenon of passing, where tens of thousands of black Americans every year decide, this being black stuff is just too rough, I'm going to be a white guy, disappear into the white population, mom, don't call, dad, don't write, I'm out of here. So it then means that, you get a situation where you have to present to your children a version of the family tree which is heavily pruned, because, there are all these relatives which, cannot be acknowledged. Finally, in terms of welfare rights, of course, and this is, I'm very familiar by now, the people who deserve welfare are those who are the deserving members of the polity. And that means that in the 1930s, when New Deal legislation is being drawn up under Roosevelt, many of the sort of crucial rules are written in such a way that blacks are explicitly excluded. For example, because domestics are not covered, the agricultural workers are not covered, and these are the populations where blacks are disproportionately represented. So originally, there's this conception that these are people who are a threat to the polity, they are not equally deserving members, they cannot be equally covered, and of course, the sort of contemporary version of this, under Reagan sort of fast-forwarding, is a black welfare queen. A person who basically is just sort of living off the system and not making any useful contribution to it. So you have a situation where the body politic has been racialized, and there's the intersection of white supremacy and patriarchy, and this brings me finally to the sort of topic that's supposed to be distinctively philosophical, justice. And alas, I can't do justice to justice because I've been told that my time is running out. But I'll just say very briefly, over 3 minutes, okay. In the last 40 years, there's been a tremendous resurrection of political philosophy in the Western world. And the book that's most responsible for this is a book that celebrates its 40th anniversary this year, John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. So there's this now huge literature on justice. And Rawls' book has been translated to 30 languages, so it's not merely a huge literature in English, but in other languages also. Thousands of articles and dozens of books. And here's the startling thing about this vast literature on justice. The startling thing is that there's barely a mention of the distinctive injustice of the modern world, that is racial injustice. Because if you accept the standard social constructionist argument, race only comes into existence in the modern world, it therefore follows you only have racial injustice in the modern world. So you then expect that philosophers would be particularly interested in this distinctive form of injustice. You would be wrong. And it's a manifestation of the fact that in terms of the self-conception of the polity, the sort of official view, is this view of the polity as this, and here I will give you Rawls' definition. We should think of society as a cooperative venture for mutual advantage with rules designated to advance everybody's interests. Now just think of that for a second in the context of US history. A white settler state established on the basis of the expropriation and killing of Native Americans and an African slavery. And Rawls says we should think of society as a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. So it then means that there's a huge disconnection between, on the one hand, a vast literature on racial justice outside of philosophy and what happens inside philosophy. So I, as a sort of black philosopher, is like 1% of the American philosophical population. There are a few of us trying to change things, and the idea is, starting point is we need to rethink how the body politic is conceptualized. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Anupama Rao. She is Associate Professor at Barnard College, but she comes to us today from the Institute of Advanced Study for the Behavioral Sciences. Her main interest is colonialism and humanitarianism, which is worked out in a recent book called The Caste Question. And she's going to speak today on violence and humanity, or thinking vulnerability as political subjectivity.
I'm going to come to some of these questions about what is seen and unseen, which Charles was speaking about, in a slightly different way. That is, to ask about what happens when we have a state that engages in the production of laws that are ostensibly meant to protect its most vulnerable citizens. So my talk today focuses on the problematic permeability between humanity and violence. That is, on the paradoxical manner in which violence, both spectacular and everyday, serves to confirm the partial or uncertain humanity of historically stigmatized subjects. In my case, I'll be speaking about Dalits or ex-untouchables. You have a little sign up about who Dalits are and the process, in a sense, of claiming a stigmatized identity, indeed, as the entry into the political, which has been part of the process in post-colonial India after its independence. So my talk today will be framed around a discussion of the new juridical category of the so-called caste atrocity. And I want to give you a sense of how Dalit bodies, historically stigmatized but politically potent and visible, given the extent and scope of India's affirmative actions regime, have become bodies of the state. That is, I want to look at how laws to prevent anti-Dalit violence and to protect Dalits have actually succeeded in making caste violence visible and increasingly the site for new political activism. That is, I want to suggest that violence and its adjudication have themselves become the site for new formations of caste politics. Sexual violence plays a particularly important role here, and this includes everything from preventing intercaste relationships to upper caste men's assumptions of access to lower caste and Dalit women as a matter of caste privilege, to the violation of Dalit women to teach a lesson to their communities. What it does, amongst other things, sexual violence, is to blur the ways in which violent responses to new situations, that is, increasing caste mobility, the urbanization of Dalits and lower castes, end up repeating archaic forms of punishment, and a return to a social hierarchy of caste that law and politics today wish to erase. So amongst other things, I want to think about this logic of the return, that is, the relationship between political violence and symbolic degradation, as well as the productive role of violence as a form of political communication in enabling new kinds of politics. I'm going to begin with an incident that reflects the kinds of violence that I'm speaking about. The ghastliest incident of sexual violence in the state of Maharashtra, where I work, in recent memory, occurred on September 29th of 2006 in the village of Khairlanji in Bhandara district in the state of Maharashtra. What became as a land grab by local agriculturalists ended in the rape and mutilation of 44-year-old Sureka Bhotmange and her teenaged student daughter Priyanka, and the brutal murder of Sureka's two sons, Roshan and Sudhir, aged 19 and 21 respectively. By all accounts, this was an upwardly mobile Dalit family. Sudhir was a graduate. He worked as a laborer with his visually impaired brother to earn extra money. Priyanka, the young girl who was killed, had topped class 12. However, this family was paraded, naked, beaten, stoned, sexually abused, and then murdered by a group of men from the Kunbi and Kalar agricultural castes. Sureka and her daughter Priyanka were bitten, beaten black and blue, and gang raped in full public view for an hour before they died. Iron rods and sticks were later inserted in their genitalia. The private parts and faces of the young men were disfigured. And I quote, "When the dark had settled, 4 bodies of this Dalit family lay strewn at the village chowpal, or the village square, with the killers pumping their fists and kicking the bodies. Their rage was not over. Some angry men even raped and badly mutilated corpses of the 2 women. The bodies were later scattered at the periphery of the village." It took more than a month for the news to spread. Internet discussion groups in the so-called Dalit blogosphere played a vital role. Web versions of the event circulated far and wide, as did photographs of the mutilated bodies of the victims, compensating for the lack of coverage by mainstream news media. Dalit and grassroots organizations filed petitions with the government, and by November of that year, photographs of the victims' bodies were pasted on the walls of Dalit bastis or residential areas, inciting protest across the state, demanding that the state hold the culprits accountable. What came to light instead was police cover-up, bureaucratic mishandling, and utter disregard for victims' justice. While this is not untypical of how incidents of caste violence are handled, there was a difference this time around. Anti-Dalit violence was followed by highly publicized Dalit counter-violence. Media exposure of the Kerlanji incident was closely followed by news that a statue of B.R. Ambedkar had been desecrated in the state of Uttar Pradesh and provoked retaliatory violence in Mumbai and elsewhere in Maharashtra. For those who don't know, Ambedkar was a Dalit leader who engaged in a famous conflict with Gandhi over political rights for Dalits, led the only autonomous Dalit movement of colonial India, was a political theorist and a constitutional lawyer, educated partly at Columbia University, and the architect of India's constitution. And here's some public and political representations of Ambedkar in various slums in the city of Nagpur, which is close to Kerlanji, where the incident took place. Right? Now, Ambedkar statues have played a central role in the constitution of a Dalit popular. At stake is Ambedkar's singular individuality, the agentive power of self-determination to remake the Dalit self, and thereby challenge the social invisibility and humiliation to which the community was relegated. Ambedkar statues are a social fact in almost every village in Maharashtra and have been for many decades now. And the erection of statues in other parts of this country is more recent. In 1997 alone, 15,000 statues of Ambedkar were installed across the state of Uttar Pradesh and provoked widespread conflict with caste Hindus who saw this as a challenge to their hegemony. Now, I want to underline that it's not important whether the statue's desecration, coming back to the Kerlanji incident and what followed, was indeed the cause of Dalit counter-violence. More significant, and what I want to point to here, is its role as crucial currency in re-signifying public space and making it amenable to an agonistic Dalit presence, and the way in which the displacement of the violence of Kerlanji was actually displaced onto the desecration of a community icon. And there was more to the counter-violence that followed, but I'm interested in moving away from this particular event and thinking a little more broadly about caste violence itself. To attribute to violence a purely instrumental or utilitarian function, seeing it either as a reaction to Dalit economic mobility or to the political mobilization of Dalits, which is the way that many instances of caste violence get analyzed, is to detour around an uncomfortable social fact. Violence is pedagogical instruction in a symbolic order that might be obscured by modern state forms and discourse. It's likely that the brutal ritual desecration of the gendered Dalit body is a technology of violence that resurrects archaic forms of sexual violence and punishment in direct proportion to the politicization of Dalits today, and the state's efforts to outlaw practices of caste violation. That is, the extremity of anti-Dalit violence suggests, somewhat paradoxically, that the symbolic significance and the semiotic density of violence as punishment and degradation are deepened even as caste violence becomes political. And it's this dialectic that I want to open up in the rest of the talk. I want to begin by looking at how legal regulation assumed Dalit vulnerability as the grounds of social and political recognition in the post-independence period, and might even lead to the apparent revitalization of these archaic practices of humiliation, degradation, and ultimately of a re-stigmatization of caste. Lest I be misunderstood, my intent is not merely to critique protective laws, but to examine how legal logics constitute affects and identities that are politically consequential for subaltern subjects by reactivating and repoliticizing idioms and repertoires of symbolic violence and humiliation. And then I want to look at how sexual violence per se figures as a form of caste violence, both excessive and inscrutable in its presence as a defining feature of Dalit subjectivity. That is, I'm interested in how law, violence, and politics together constitute and gender the Dalit body. So let me speak a little bit to this notion of the atrocity, the caste atrocity. Violence against Dalits or India's ex-untouchables is both a social fact and social embarrassment. It even goes by a specific name, the caste atrocity. Indeed, untouchability became a state topic at the moment of post-colonial transition and India's negotiated political independence in 1947. Between 1947 and 1955, the Dalit citizen was conceived as a specific kind of subject through the institution of an elaborate civil rights regime and through the secularization of Hinduism. The state's commitment to equalization and equalizing unequal or stigmatized bodies via positive discrimination for socially marginal and deprived populations is worthy of note. Whereas a liberal democracy, the racial state that we just heard about, commits to the sanctity of specific procedures believed to guarantee unbiased outcomes, it's indeed noteworthy that India's democracy specifies both the desired outcomes and the gulf separating the present from them. That is, it puts in place active policies of equalization. The Indian Constitution abolished untouchability, but its persistence was recognized by a set of robust affirmative action policies, in addition to protective laws that conceived Dalit vulnerability and the social relations of caste in quite particular ways. Let me briefly outline this last set of legal mechanisms, not because they've succeeded in containing anti-Dalit violence, but because they've had the paradoxical effect of, on the one hand, presenting Dalits as vulnerable subjects, always already susceptible to injury, and on the other hand, emphasizing violence as the dominant mode of sociality between castes. It is this relation between caste identity, law, and violence that I'll explore through a brief history of the main strands of anti-atrocity legislation. Article 17 of the Indian Constitution reads, "Untouchability is abolished, and its practice in any form is forbidden. The enforcement of any disability arising out of untouchability shall be an offense in accordance with the law." Thus, untouchability is underscored as an exceptional practice requiring measures beyond positive discrimination, including the provision of specific criminal laws to punish those who perpetrate untouchability. The Protection of Civil Rights Act, and there have been a series of laws meant to protect Dalits from caste violence. The Protection of Civil Rights Act of 1974, which amended the 1955 Untouchable Offences Act, which initially abolished untouchability in public places, noted, quote, that civil rights accrue to persons served by the abolition of untouchability. That is, it equates civil rights with Dalits. By 1989, the Prevention of Atrocities Act included as criminal acts those that we might usually consider political, ritual, and symbolic. Section 3.1 placed humiliation, caste insults, coercion to eat or drink noxious substances on a par with the denial of access to water sources, public property and thoroughfares, noted that sexual violence against Dalit women was legislable by law, economic dispossession such as land grabs and demands to perform bonded labor, as well as attempts to prevent voting or holding political office by Dalits. In the absence of a legal definition to untouchability, which has been the case throughout, atrocity laws have themselves produced the definition of untouchability, which is lacking in constitutional laws and provisions. These include a list of acts or public manifestations of the practice that encompass, as I've suggested, ritual and symbolic humiliation, as well as acts of physical violence. Equivalence increasingly between hurtful words and harmful deeds has come to be assumed in law. Ironically, laws against anti-Dalit violence have operated without a definition of untouchability, as I said. While the reason offered initially was that defining untouchability would risk reinscribing the stigma of naming those who suffered from that practice, the more interesting outcome to such definitional fluidity has been that untouchability has worked on an I know it when I see it model of knowledge, which gives state officials great leeway in interpreting anti-Dalit crime. One consequence of this has been that laws meant to transform existing social relations have over time come to depend on and reify precisely those social conventions and practices they are in the process of transforming. Thus, the legal discourse around untouchability has also reproduced the social fact of untouchability, albeit with a difference. Though atrocities laws are preventive, they are also productive. They reorganize social life around new governmental categories that themselves become available as objects of social and political attachment. By defining Dalits as injured subjects who are susceptible to continued harm, protective measures produce a more proximate relation between Dalits and the state, even as they impel the development of regulatory structures and disciplinary mechanisms to protect them. In contrast to practices of equalization, that is, affirmative action policies that are meant to equalize Dalit status in relation to other political subjects, and which sought to bring Dalits within a normative framework of socioeconomic relations, atrocity legislation was an exceptional measure that emphasized the Dalit status as a historically stigmatized subject in the very act of imagining justice for her. As untouchability was framed through its contiguity with the juridical category of atrocity, Its association with crime began to lift the everyday practice of untouchability out of these contexts, these embedded contexts of the everyday, and to propel it into the realm of performance and spectacle. Caste sociality, social relations between caste Hindus and Dalits, untouchables, came under intense regulation because they were perceived to carry the potentiality of violence. So in a sense, this is the flattening out or the redefinition of sociality across caste as always already containing the possibility of anti-caste violence. Rather than containing violence, the social form of the caste atrocity constitutes something like a force field, a magnetic force, around which new formations of violence, which resurrect symbologies of ritual degradation and humiliation, cohere. It's this doubling of the ritual and the political, I suggest, that we see at work in something like the Kerlanji incident, the sex of caste. Caste is an effect of the social regulation, the regulation of sexuality and kinship, and vice versa. I want to kind of move outside of law for a second here. Therefore, sexual relationships within and between caste communities are a nodal point through which caste supremacy is reproduced or challenged. Sexual desire and violence across caste, I want to suggest, is the constitutive outside to the regulatory order of caste and kinship. The sexual economy of caste, then, is intrinsically complex. It prohibits all men from viewing all women as potential marriage partners, even as it gives upper caste men the right to enjoy Dalit and lower caste women. Indeed, knowledge of this is a public secret, normalized as privilege by the upper castes, and experienced as a shameful secret by its victims. Sexual violence, then, is the other side to norms governing both caste purity and social respectability. And this, I want to suggest, is because caste hegemony is secured in two ways: by regulating caste respectability and by justifying flagrant transgression as a form of upper caste privilege. This doubled economy of caste is at work in the exchange of women within the caste community and in the informal circuits of sexual liaison with women seen as always already amenable to sexual violation by right. The putatively closed circuit of marriage and respectability, what is caste, is destabilized by this other economy of sexual violence and pleasure that equates caste privilege with the availability of lower caste women as upper caste property. Although marriage regulates caste purity to some degree, the sexual economy of caste, I want to suggest, is intrinsically unstable, which is also why this relationship between caste violence and sexual violence becomes a really interesting site around which to unpack what's happening with changing social relations of caste. The problematic permeability of violence and desire, of rape and marriage, intimates that sexual violence is caste violence because it operates as the prerogative of upper caste men. The brutal violence against Dalit men accused of desiring upper caste women, which is a new form of caste violence today, further illuminates the double jeopardy of sexual violence as caste violence. As Dalits' political awareness and indeed their entry into the political through the affirmative actions regime and as well new formations of Dalit politics in the last 50 years or so in India has become increasingly prominent, so too has caste conflict intensified. And a crucial but invisible consequence of Dalit politicization has been that it's been understood as a desire on the part of Dalit men for access to upper caste women, right? So that upward mobility and political mobility is understood increasingly in terms of sexual desire and sexual access. The pernicious euphemization of sexual violence as a form of upper caste male desire also permits upper castes to imagine that fantasies of sexual possession or of the sexual violation of upper caste women are important vectors for consolidating Dalit caste masculinity. Remaining agnostic about the veracity of these assumptions, I suggest rather that the perverse logic of caste's sexual economy is that the violation of Dalit women as a matter of right and the violent disciplining of Dalit men are two sides of the same coin. Both are acts of sexual violence, and each reproduces caste power, albeit differently. This duplicity of caste and sex makes apparent why the specificity of sexual violence is so often lost when it's redefined as caste violence, or why a feminist focus on sexual violence tends to background its specificity as violence against Dalit women. When sex subjectivity is conjoined with stigmatized existence, sexual violence becomes existentially overdetermined and legally inscrutable. In conclusion, acts of symbolization and desymbolization have played a key role in the semiotic density and public salience that the term Dalit has acquired across the last century. Is this really political? Yes, I want to suggest, because the most powerful axis of Dalit political subject formation has focused on remaking the caste self and the caste body, of rethinking stigma, if you will, and the body as the experiential site of stigma through acts of political resignification. Becoming Dalit is the process through which the caste subaltern enters into circuits of political commensuration and the value regime of the human. Because the name, the body, and its social experience, being Dalit, ground down, broken to pieces, crushed, has been one of the important axes or crucial sites of political subject formation and political activism, political violence must also address this semiotic axis of Dalit corporeality, it seems to me, as a space of politics.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Edward Stein. He's Vice Dean and Professor of Law and Director of the Program in Family Law, Policy, and Bioethics at the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. He has both a PhD in philosophy from MIT and a JD degree from Yale University. His works reflect this diversity of background. He has a book entitled Without Good Reason, The Rationality Debate in Philosophy and Cognitive Science, which I assume was his philosopher phase of things. And he has several books on issues around desire, and in particular the measurement of desire, the science, theory, and ethics of sexual orientation. And he's going to speak today on sexual orientations, rights and body, immutability, essentialism, and nativism.
I'm having a little problem with my PowerPoint here, so I'll start talking and someone will help me. Many people believe that understanding how sexual orientations develop is legally, ethically, and politically relevant to lesbian, gay, and bisexual rights. Intuitively, the idea is that if you are born gay, it is wrong or illegal to punish or otherwise discriminate against you for that reason. Both advocates and opponents of LGBT rights refer to whether and how sexual orientations are embodied, specifically by talking about whether sexual orientations are innate, whether sexual orientations are unchangeable, and or whether sexual orientations are a natural fact. In the U.S. legal context, discussion of these issues focus on arguments from what I call arguments from etiology, either the born that way argument, to start with the idea that gay people are born with a sexual orientation, and or the not a choice argument, which starts from the idea that sexual orientations are not chosen. So a specific instance of this so-called argument from etiology would be something like this: same-sex sexual attractions are involuntary. It's wrong to punish people or otherwise discriminate against them for something they did not choose. Therefore, it is wrong to punish or otherwise discriminate against lesbian, gay, or bisexual people. The general legal context is in litigation about LGBT rights. This discussion connects to the role of the so-called immutability factor in the context of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which says, in part, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, and in similar clauses in state constitutions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first of all review the conceptual landscape related to sexual orientation and immutability. I'm going to do that rather quickly. I'll also offer a criticism of arguments from etiology, noting their problems, and then discuss recent court cases about marriage for same-sex couples in which immutability has played a significant role, and then conclude that how sexual orientations are embodied is not, contrary to what most folks will tell you, important to legal and ethical arguments about gay rights. So first of all, the embodiment of sexual orientations. On the one hand, I think sexual orientations are clearly embodied. Humans have sexual orientations, but rocks and fruit flies do not. And this is because sexual orientations involve beliefs and desires, which are cognitively mediated. And in humans, cognition is embodied. So while it's clear that sexual orientations are embodied, what is not clear is how sexual orientations are embodied. How are sexual orientations embodied? The debate plays itself out in whether sexual orientations are innate or environmental, immutable or changeable, essential or constructed. So, inborn or environmental, are sexual orientations innate or the result of environmental factors? The way this question is traditionally framed is based on a false dichotomy. No human characteristic is the result of genetics only or strictly the result of environmental factors. All human traits are the result of both. There is, however, a range of the extent to which genes constrain a human trait. One's blood type is more tightly constrained by genetic factors than what one decides to major in college if one goes to college. The proper question then, when we ask whether sexual orientation is inborn or environmental, the proper question for when we start thinking about how sexual orientation are embodied is where does sexual orientation fit on this continuum, the imagined continuum between blood type on one side and college major on the other. This debate connects in complicated ways that I can't sort out today for you to the debate between essentialists and constructionists, which some of the other panelists have either directly or indirectly talked about. Essentialism is the view that claims our contemporary categories of sexual orientation can be applied to people in any culture and at any point in history. And constructionism about sexual orientation emphasizes the historical and cultural contingencies of sexual orientation and sexuality. This connects to, I think, the debate about natural kinds, natural human kinds. Underlying the disagreement between essentialism and constructionism is this debate about natural kinds, or in particular natural human kinds. A natural kind is a grouping of entities that plays a central role in the correct scientific laws and explanations. A group is a natural human kind in virtue of the properties its members share, or the functions they play independent of how we conceive of them. So paradigmatic natural kinds would be gold, electrons, hemoglobin, hearts, and groupings that are not natural kinds would be chairs, teddy bears, diet soft drinks, or mistaken natural kind terms like phlogiston or ether. Natural human kinds are groupings of people that play a central role in scientific explanations and laws. For example, people with blood type AB. Non-natural human kinds include members of the Democratic Party, or Republican Party for that matter, and sort of outdated terms that were thought to be natural human kinds, like the 19th century idea of the hysteric woman. The debate between essentialism and constructionism about sexual orientation, thus as I understand it, amounts to whether sexual orientation are properly understood as natural human kinds. This debate, the debate between essentialism and constructionism, also connects in complicated ways to the debate about whether sexual orientations are immutable or changeable. Although there's some, I think, more clarity about mutability and changeability of sexual orientations. People's conscious choices do not play a strong role in the development of sexual orientations. For most adults, it's very difficult, although not impossible, to change sexual orientations, although there's some dispute from so-called reparative therapists on this point, although they are mostly scientifically discredited. Sexual orientations do not, however, need to be biologically determined in order to be immutable. For example, an unresolved Oedipal complex might also be immutable. Innateness or nativism about sexual orientation is consistent with choice playing a significant role in the development and expressions of sexual orientation. And so questions about sexual orientation and choice are in some ways complicated, as might be shown, for example, that even a genetic theory of sexual orientation must allow that environmental factors shape sexual orientation, because there's a significant number of identical twins raised together who are discordant for sexual orientation. So it can't be explained simply by their genetics. It also can't be explained by shared environmental factors like having grown up in the same household. It has to be explained by other more nuanced environmental factors. Okay. So that's sort of the conceptual foundation for some of the questions that interest me. I now want to turn my attention to arguments from etiology. Again, the born that way and not a choice arguments. There are empirical problems, which I'm going to set aside today. Instead, I'm going to focus on ethical, pragmatic, bioethical, and primarily legal problems for these kinds of arguments. So, ethical problem with the arguments from etiology. Even if sexual orientations were innate or proven to not be chosen, much of what is ethically, socially, and legally relevant about being a lesbian, gay, or bisexual person is not innate and not determined. And thus, these aspects of sexual orientation would not be reached by arguments from etiology. In other words, even if sexual orientations were like eye color, that they're strongly genetic, actually engaging in sexual acts with a person of the same sex, openly identifying as a gay, lesbian, or bisexual person, deciding to establish a household with a person of the same sex, or raising children as open gay people would be choices. And they're choices that are important for lesbian and gay rights to protect, and yet they're choices that would not be reached by arguments from etiology that focus on things that are not chosen and that are innate. A pragmatic problem with arguments from etiology. There's an observation that advocates of arguments from etiology have embraced, that if you do opinion survey polls, you find that people who think homosexuality is strongly biological or not chosen are dramatically more likely to support lesbian and gay rights than those who don't. But the problem is that arguments from so you think, gee, there's a great pragmatic argument. If we can convince people to think that homosexuality is strongly biological, they're going to be more supportive of gay rights. So that's a reason to make the argument from etiology. The problem is, first of all, it's risky to link civil rights to research that's in its early stage. The opinion polls only show correlation, not causation, and historically, making arguments from etiology have not worked, and they've often, in fact, been turned against lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. Finally, I want to point out a bioethical problem with arguments from etiology. Making arguments from etiology will spurn interest in procedures that select for particular sexual orientations that will in turn have a deleterious effect on LGBT people. So, for example, using some kind of selection techniques at the reproductive technological stage, amniocentesis screening to detect the gay gene, making the argument from etiology would actually have the effects of increasing interest in the possibility of doing that. And even if such procedures, the idea of screening for the gay gene, even if such procedures don't work, people will think they work, and the social effects will be bad for gay people. So I now want to turn in my remaining 5 minutes to the legal treatment of arguments from etiology. So I'll have to be a little quick here. Some courts have found that immutability is neither necessary nor sufficient for a classification to be constitutionally suspect. That means to get heightened scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. I'll talk more about two decisions, one in Maryland and one in Washington. Although this has been changing in the past several years, most courts have said sexual orientation classifications are not like categories of race or gender. They're not suspect. And they say, among the following things, sexual orientations are not immutable because some people can change. Sexual orientations are behavior-based classifications, and it simply hasn't been proven that sexual orientations are immutable. Some courts, instead, have embraced this idea that I'll talk about in a few moments, that sexual orientations are softly immutable. So I'm going to talk quickly about this in the context of relationship recognition for same-sex couples in the United States. We currently have a patchwork of recognition and non-recognition for relationships between people of the same sex. Here's a quick map. The maps with some kind of color in them are maps where relationships between same-sex couples are legally recognized in one or another way. The rest of the country, no such recognition. This is sort of the reverse. The maps with color here don't prohibit recognition of same-sex relationships, and the maps with stuff filled in some way or other prohibit certain kinds of recognition of same-sex couples. So that's the sort of legal background in which these debates that I'm going to be talking about now take place. So the Washington Supreme Court took the following approach when faced with an argument from etiology. To classify as a suspect class for purposes of equal protection analysis, the character defining the class must be an obvious immutable trait. The plaintiffs, in this case same-sex couples wanting recognition for their relationships, do not cite any authority in support of the conclusion that homosexuality is an immutable characteristic. They must show immutability, and they haven't. No proof, says the Washington Supreme Court, so no right to recognition of same-sex marriage. Maryland took a very similar approach based on scientific and sociological evidence. We are unable to take judicial notice that gay, lesbian, and bisexual persons display readily recognizable immutable characteristics that define the group. We therefore decline to recognize sexual orientation as an immutable trait and therefore as a suspect or quasi-suspect classification. Now, an alternative approach, which has been embraced by some courts and by some advocates, is to argue that a trait, instead of being immutable, is softly immutable. So whether or not it is immutable in traditional sense, it could be softly immutable if changing it would involve so great a physical difficulty, or it would be such a trait would be so central to a person's identity that it would be abhorrent for the government to penalize a person for refusing to change this trait. So, for example, religion could be softly immutable. One's religious affiliation could be softly immutable. It's not genetic. It's not impossible to change. You could change your religious affiliation, but it's so central to a person's identity it would be abhorrent for the government to penalize a person for refusing to change them. And some folks have argued that sexual orientation is immutable in this soft sense. So the Connecticut Supreme Court did that. It says, because sexual orientation is an essential component of personhood, even if there is some possibility that a person's sexual preference can be altered, it would be wholly unacceptable for the state to do so. Similar analysis in the Iowa Supreme Court. Because sexual orientation is central to a personal identity and may be altered only at the expense of significant damage to an individual's sense of self, classifications based on sexual orientation are no less entitled to consideration as a suspect or quasi-suspect class than any other group that is deemed to exhibit an immutable characteristic. So in Iowa and in Connecticut, the state Supreme Courts have found sexual orientation to be sort of immutable and thus deserving of heightened protection, and thus same-sex couples should get the right to same-sex marriage in those jurisdictions. But they've done it through this idea of soft immutability. Now, the problems with soft immutability is that at least when the U.S. Supreme Court talks about immutability, it doesn't seem to be talking about soft immutability, but the old-fashioned hard immutability. It's impossible to change. And even if soft immutability is a necessary condition, the problem is it's not a sufficient condition. Some characteristics, such as, for example, a disposition for alcoholism or sexual attraction to youths, might be immutable in the soft sense of the term, but they're not treated as demanding heightened scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause. thirdly, soft immutability is very broad and does not really fit with the common use of the notion of immutability in legal or in everyday contexts. However, compared to immutability, soft immutability is easier to prove, and courts like Connecticut and Iowa have found that sexual orientations are suspect classifications on this basis, which is better than standard immutability. So, my conclusion. Advocates of LGBT rights should avoid making arguments from etiology in courts, in legislative contexts, in public discourse. We shouldn't talk about whether sexual orientations are chosen, innate, essential, or not. It's not helpful. These arguments are neither valid nor persuasive, and they are risky. History has shown that they can be turned against LGBT people. If, however, as a litigator you are forced to talk about immutability, perhaps because you're before a court that thinks immutability is a relevant condition, it's best to argue immutability is not a necessary condition, or to try to convince the court that it should really be concerned with soft immutability. In general, however, talk of soft immutability is also to be avoided because it's easily confused with hard immutability, and any talk of etiology is simply out of place in the ethical, political, and legal context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure some of you are glad to hear our last speaker is Michael Pelitz, who is a professor of the Department of Anthropology, Emory University. He has 6 books to his credit. His area of expertise is in Southeast Asia. One of the early book is entitled A Share of the Harvest. More recently, Islamic Modern, and more recently yet, Gender Pluralism, Southeast Asia Since Early Modern Times. And he is going to speak today on Gender Pluralism, Muslim Southeast Asia Society Since Early Modern Times.
Can I move this way? Okay, please. Thank you. This paper concerns Southeast Asian Muslims since the beginning of the early modern era, the period from the 15th to the 18th century. I'm especially interested in pluralistic sensibilities and dispositions concerning gender and sexuality, which I subsume under the rubric of gender pluralism. Like other kinds of pluralisms, gender pluralism is highly relative. Indeed, the examples I discuss are appropriately viewed as components of systems of graduated pluralism. The latter term draws attention to the differential distribution throughout societies of sentiments and institutionalized arrangements conducive to or inhibiting pluralism, many of which are keyed to regimes of stratified reproduction, defined as encompassing systems of power relations that encourage certain groups' reproduction while discouraging that of others. I pay particular attention to the roles of transgendered persons and the sexual variability associated with them. I should thus note that I use the term transgender to refer to individuals involved in behaviors that transcend or transgress majoritarian gender practices. One of my arguments is that the vicissitudes of transgenderism index a number of culturally interlocked processes that have occurred in Southeast Asia since early modern times. These include the increased formalization and segregation of gender roles, the distancing of women from loci of power and prestige, and the ascendance of a certain type of heteronormativity. Muslim Southeast Asia has long been known for deeply entrenched traditions of pluralism with respect to gender and sexuality. During the first half of the early modern era, religious traditions throughout the region were profoundly dualistic, with both male and female elements needing to be present to give power and effect. Women predominated in rituals keyed to agriculture, birth, death, and healing, perhaps because their reproductive capacities were seen as giving them regenerative and spiritual powers that men could not match. This period was characterized by relations between males and females that were relatively egalitarian compared with male-female relations in other world areas, though this is not to suggest complete equality between males and females. This was also a period characterized by a good deal of female autonomy and social control, by considerable fluidity in gender roles, and by relative tolerance and indulgence with respect to many things sexual, at least for the commoner majority. 16th century Portuguese observers reported that Malays were, quote, fond of music and given to love, end of quote, and that virginity at marriage was not expected of either party. Others emphasized similar patterns when writing about Javanese and other Muslims in the region. Some of these patterns were grounded in the Hindu-Buddhist sensibilities that informed early Southeast Asian Islam. It merits note in any case that Islam is often described as a, quote, sex-positive religion. This is partly because Islamic doctrine views lawful sexual acts as divinely approved forms of pleasure. Of more immediate concern, however, is the bounded nature of this sex positivity. For instance, that Southeast Asian Muslims guilty of incest or adultery in early modern times might be immersed in vats of molten metal or subject to other gruesome punishment. These punishments make clear that the pluralism suffusing many realms of gender and sexuality was domain-specific and otherwise bounded, though far more expansive than today. In light of the religious patterns outlined here, it should not be surprising to find that during the 15th and 16th centuries, many communities accorded enormous prestige to male-bodied individuals who dressed in female attire, especially but not only, while they performed rituals associated with royal regalia and agriculture. Such individuals, along with female-bodied ritualists, who sometimes engaged in transgendered behavior as well, served as sacred mediators between males and females and between humans and the domains of spirits and nature. Consider, for example, the bisu. This term denotes ritual specialists among the Bugis of Sulawesi, who, like other Indonesians, have long identified with a syncretic variant of Islam. Male-bodied bisu assumed female attire, safeguarded the sacred symbols of ruling families, and engaged in sexual and marital relations that were simultaneously homosexual and heterogender. In other words, a bisu typically married and had sex with a person having male genitals who was gendered male, unlike the bisu who was performatively feminized. The heterogender nature of the relationship is noteworthy inasmuch as it points to the more encompassing but largely implicit heterogender matrix that has long existed among Southeast Asian Muslims. This cosmologically grounded matrix rendered heterogender same-sex relationships legitimate, even imbued with sanctity in certain contexts, just as it defined homogender relations as completely beyond the pale. Noteworthy, too, is that the heterogender matrix was of far greater cultural salience than any analogous matrices defined in relation to heterosexuality. Same-sex relations also occurred among male and female-bodied Bugis who were not ritual specialists and seem to have been accorded as much honor as more conventional majoritarian arrangements, so long as they were heterogender. These facts, along with women's ready access to the highest offices in the land, suggest that gender pluralism suffused a variety of analytically distinct domains. It is significant that some scholars of this era of Southeast Asian history have spoken of the respect accorded bisexualism, that's a quote, the respect accorded bisexualism, both at the aesthetic level and beyond. One reason for this pattern may be that bisexualism, like transvestism, combined elements from and simultaneously transcended the male-female duality that structured and animated the universe in its entirety. Another may be that, in combining elements of male and female, bisexualism and transvestitism symbolize purity, totality, and the unfractured universe posited to exist before the advent of humanity and difference. No small matter is that in many local cosmologies, ancestral spirits were androgynous or existed in male-female pairs. Ritual specialists exhibiting androgyny were thus ideally situated both to communicate and negotiate with these spirits and to personify them. More generally, just as local cosmologies undergirded state rituals of various kinds, so too did many of these state rituals resonate with locally salient mythologies, as well as social structural arrangements involving, for example, bilateral kinship and relatively high rates of divorce, remarriage, and adoption that encouraged trading places and conceptual and moral relativism. This situation serves as a reminder that when thinking about states, we need to range beyond consideration of the utilitarian roles they play in controlling bodies or protecting them. States do, of course, endeavor to control and protect bodies, just as they levy taxes and wage wars. But some of them are also grounded in cosmologies valorizing gendered and sexual arrangements that cannot be reduced to cultural logics based on utilitarianism. I want to proceed to a discussion of dynamics since the second half of the early modern period, roughly the 17th and 18th centuries. This period witnessed dramatic transformations in many realms of society and culture. These transformations occurred in the context of dialectically related processes involving the intensification of commerce, state building, and territorial consolidation. Integrally related to these processes was the heightened centrality in courtly realms and beyond of Sunni Islam. This male-oriented, legalistic, and hierarchical world religion, that's a quote, as Barbara Endaya describes it, makes no scriptural provision for the public ritual centrality of women or transgendered individuals. Due to the spread of canonical orthodoxies, the previously sacrosanct roles of women and transgendered individuals in public ritual were subject to declines in prestige and legitimacy. So too was much, but not all, of the sexual license that had long characterized the region. These trends went hand in hand with a number of other dynamics that proved detrimental to women and pluralism alike. The relative exclusion of women from political office, an increase in poverty, and the demise of female craft specializations. Many of these trends continued in subsequent centuries. Such was due in no small measure to the impact of Dutch and British colonial rule, Protestant missionary activity, and increasingly muscular states promoting capitalism and ideologies of high modernity. Political and other developments outlined here stimulated the growth of religious nationalisms and educational reform, which also constricted the religious and ritual spaces accorded women and the transgendered. More generally, they severed ties linking transgendered ritualists with religious orthodoxy and state power alike. Among the Bugis, for instance, the adoption of Islam by 1611 posed serious dilemmas for transgendered ritual specialists, the Bisu. This is partly because the mostly male-bodied Bisu had same-sex spouses. Another problem was their claim of descent from the gods, hence divinity, a major heresy in Islam. Thus, beginning in the early 1600s, we see periodic efforts by Islamic rulers to expel Bisu from their jurisdictions. The imposition of Dutch colonial rule in Sulawesi in the early 20th century resulted in additional challenges to Bisu, as did Indonesia's independence in 1949. The two sets of developments were, of course, quite different, but they both contributed to the elimination of long sovereign kingdoms, thus depriving Bisu of their royal patrons and their raison d'etre. The genealogical and other texts that underwrote their sanctity have also become largely irrelevant due to the spread throughout Indonesia of modern-day science, education, and transnational Islam. This is not to suggest that Bisu, transgendering, and same-sex sexuality have disappeared from Sulawesi, for they have not. The post-Suharto era, which began in 1998, has even witnessed a Bisu renaissance of sorts, though how long that lasts is anyone's guess. Indonesian cases such as these are quite dramatic, but they can also convey the erroneous impression that historical processes involving the diminished legitimacy of transgenderism and the transformation of gender pluralism generally were all-encompassing, uniform, or monolithic. This was definitely not the case. Nor should we assume that the development of sanctions discouraging transgendered practices and same-sex relations were typically of the formal legal variety. They were not. Far more common were diffuse and informal sanctions, such as gossip and ostracism, albeit primarily when private activities were made public, or when individuals involved in transgendering or same-sex sexuality failed to honor expectations associated with marrying properly and upholding other community norms. Put differently, an ethos of don't ask, don't tell pervaded many Muslim Southeast Asian cultures of gender, sexuality, and jurisprudence until fairly recently. Despite the thrust of the long-term historical processes outlined here, a good deal of gender pluralism existed in Muslim Southeast Asia well into the 20th century. Most categories of women and femininity, for example, continued to be valorized in positive ways. And even though some anthropological accounts bearing on transgenderism and same-sex relations suggest a certain dismissiveness, ambivalence, and, arguably, a euphemized violence of exclusion, they also document subjectivities and attitudes that were relatively positive, albeit less so than in earlier times. We might thus look at the proverbial glass as either half empty or half full. I begin with the half-empty perspective, briefly enumerating four sets of dynamics that eroded gender pluralism over the long term. First, forces of political centralization, some of which involved the expansion and consolidation of state power at the expense of local polities. Second, the development of nationalist and modernist discourses emphasizing rationalized religion, science, economic progress, secular education, and mass literacy. Third, processes of urbanization, bureaucratization, and industrialization, coupled with the rise of capitalist economies. These dynamics entailed widely ramifying institutional and cultural rationalization that undercut the moral basis of agrarian communities and the cosmologies in which they were embedded. They simultaneously contributed to increased social differentiation, along with new forms of discipline and control geared toward producing heightened normativity in all areas of social life. A fourth dynamic involved the colonial era encounter between Islam and Protestantism. As Muslim political and religious elites negotiated the cultural and political intrusions of mostly Protestant Westerners, they adopted their strongly dichotomous notions of gender and sexuality, also embracing the general repression of overt sexuality, along with Victorian sexual norms on the whole. More generally, because of the broadly encompassing dynamics outlined here, many rituals associated with dual-gendered or female spirits have fallen by the wayside. In addition, transgendering, like femininity, has been stripped of many of its positive associations with the sacred. Its long-standing centrality in state courts, royal palaces, and the reproduction of local polities exists primarily in scattered memories and in dusty archives. As regards its contemporary loci, it tends to be most visible in secular venues of fashion and entertainment, in the increasingly scrutinized and disciplined private domain, and, of course, on the internet. When viewed from the perspective of the longue durée, we see that many variants of transgendering and all types of same-sex relations have been subject to processes of secularization, stigmatization, and medicalization, and that some of them, in Malaysia, for example, have been heavily criminalized as well. We also see that many transgendered individuals have been redefined as contaminating rather than sacred mediators who, to paraphrase a point made by Stallybrass and White in another context, are perversely, if not treasonously, muddling the increasingly dichotomous terms of sex-gender systems long characterized by pluralism. If, on the other hand, we view the proverbial glass mentioned earlier as half full, we need to ask a different question. Why is gender pluralism still relatively robust in many Muslim Southeast Asian societies, despite the forces long arrayed against it? A partial answer has to do with agency and resistance on the part of those targeted by forces hostile to pluralism. A related factor is that many systems of myth, ritual, and cosmology continue to be culturally salient, encouraging imaginative play and an appreciation of different ways of being in the world. Also germane, particularly since pluralistic sentiments and dispositions begin at home, is the previously noted nexus of social structural dynamics that valorize the conceptual and other shifts involved in viewing things from different perspectives. Owing partly to their synergy, these dynamics encourage conceptual and moral relativism. In conclusion, I want to emphasize two sets of issues bearing on the proliferation of sexual and gender diversity that has occurred in Muslim Southeast Asia in the last few decades, largely as a consequence of globalizing forces. The first involves a loosening of the hegemonic deep structure that long informed subjectivities, as well as the directionality and embodiment of potentially erotic enterprises. I use the term loosening here because we are not dealing with a shattering of a hegemony in a Gramscian sense, nor with an epistemic rupture or succession a la Foucault. The evidence for this loosening includes the emergence in the past few decades of at least two new classes of individuals. One consists of female-identified women who are erotically involved with other women. What is new and distinctive about these women is that their subject positions and subjectivities are defined not only by their female gender, but also by their sexual orientation as lesbians or women who have sex with women. The other group consists of masculine-identified men who pursue erotic relations with other men. These men are also distinctive in that their subject positions and subjectivities are likewise defined both by their gender and by their sexual orientation. Partly because gender identities in Southeast Asia have always subsumed and effectively defined sexual orientations, scholars like Dennis Altman see in these developments evidence of the ways that Asian homosexualities, that's his term, are being westernized or otherwise reconfigured by transnational globalizing developments. In my view, however, the shifts are not as dramatic as they appear at first glance. I say this because feminine-identified lesbians tend to form erotic relationships exclusively with masculine-identified lesbians, just as masculine-identified gay men are inclined towards sexual relations with feminized gays. These relationships, though sexualized, are still heterogender as far as the participants and others are concerned. As such, they fit comfortably within the heterogender matrix that has long been hegemonic throughout the region. A second and final set of issues related has to do with the concept of heteronormativity. While I referred to this concept at the outset of my remarks, it is too ethnocentric to be of much use to me. The prefix hetero in heteronormativity refers uncritically to heterosexuality, thus problematically privileging sexual difference over gender difference. The 2002 Handbook of Lesbian and Gay Studies, for example, defines heteronormativity as, and I quote, the view that institutionalized heterosexuality constitutes the standard for legitimate and expected social and sexual relations, end of quote. Many who use the term ignore the heterosexual-hetero distinction altogether, assuming that ostensibly bedrock sexualized difference is invariably the defining feature of personal identity, the difference that matters most. As commonly defined, heteronormativity is not applicable to Muslim Southeast Asia in early modern times or subsequently, unless the prefix hetero refers to gender rather than sexuality. The term does, in any event, obscure significant dynamics that have occurred in recent years, one nexus of which involves the loosening, though continued prevalence, the loosening, though continued prevalence and partial sexualization of the heterogender matrix. Thank you.
Thank you. H.L. Mencken said there were two kinds of people in the world, those that divide the world into two and those that do not. We've lived in a world this afternoon which I think Mencken would have felt very uncomfortable with. And I'm going to invite people that want to take this already complex world and make it even more complex by asking questions to walk up to the microphone and ask your question. Please don't raise your hand. Make the physical effort to move forward to the microphone. It would be very helpful if you did so. We'll start with you. You got the first microphone.
Yeah, it's a very simple question for Dr. Rao. It's very unfortunate these atrocities against Dalits are happening even now, in the 21st century. In good old days, they used to be punished for simple reason like, let me go back. The experience was comparable to that of slaves here. They were supposed to stick to certain boundaries. If they trespassed the boundary, they used to be punished by upper caste people. It could be moving into a new neighborhood, even dressing the way upper caste people are dressing, or even using refined language, which only upper caste people are supposed to use. For the reason in those cases, in those days, used to be one of these or many others. Now, it is happening that they are becoming very politically powerful, and out of jealousy, a lot of atrocities are taking place. Out of jealousy, upper caste people are taking it on them. So this 2006 incident that you narrated, in which category would you put that?
Well, I think what I was trying to suggest actually was that there's a kind of fungibility between, what is seen to be a very modern form of political violence, right? This was an upwardly mobile Dalit family. They were punished within the context of the village because they'd actually acquired land. They were, in fact, much more urbanized and one could say modernized, in a sense, than these agricultural castes who actually came and attacked this family. But what I was trying to do was to actually speak to the fungibility, the way in which new forms of violence actually replicate existing kind of symbolic repertoires of humiliation and degradation, right? So I think, I would agree with what you're saying, that this is a new formation of violence that we see taking place in direct response in many ways to both Dalit politicization on their own terms, as well as what it has opened up in the context of changing social relations of caste and class within the village, but that the way that those forms of punishment then get meted out are in forms that actually are not cognizable by the state because they replicate these earlier forms of sociality and kind of intimacy, a kind of perverted, deformed intimacy, and that one needs to think about both of these. So there's something, I was sort of trying to play with the temporality of the violence, saying that there's something that's both new, but that is archaic. And so trying to think about sort of the coexistence of both of those. But I think I agree with you that this is, I would put this into the new formation of violence, certainly. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go on to the next.
Yes, this is for Professor Najmabadi. I'm wondering if you would be willing to go back and historicize a little bit what's going on. I'm sorry. I'm wondering if you would be willing to go back and historicize a little bit about this situation in Iran by discussing attitudes and practice of homosexuality and transsexuality in the Safavid period and how that might have evolved into what's going on today?
All the way to 17th, 16th century. I'm not sure these categories are very useful to think with and use. My work is either 19th century or in this project starts in the 1930s and comes to the present time. So I don't feel I can do that. Sorry.
Okay, next.
This question is for Professor Marcus. I was very interested in your desire to theorize a new way of looking at sexuality without talking about the sexual body. I think it's interesting talking to other people who identify as LGBT, and myself identifying as a gay man. We're sort of desiring to defend what we would term our identity when society is telling us or asking us to defend our sexuality. But several theorists I know, like feminist film theorists, in talking about groups of women, queer theorists like Eve Sedgwick talking about groups of men in literature, have used the word homosocial. And I wondered if a term like that, or even, I think, some people trying to use the word homophile, if that's sort of going in the direction you're talking about, or if there's sort of more that needs to be done there.
Mm-hmm. I would say that the idea of the homosocial is often deployed as a way of putting many, many kinds of behaviors and feelings and acts that we could see as separate on a spectrum. So, I mean, I love Eve Sedgwick's work, and, the book Between Men, obviously my book Between Women is in dialogue with Between Men in a lot of ways, and at the time it was written, made an enormous intervention, and she was actually interested in the ways that for men there wasn't a spectrum between the homosocial and the homosexual, and what it might mean to imagine a world where that movement between the social and the sexual was easier. But since Adrienne Rich, really, relationships between women and lesbianism has been thought of as a spectrum with intimacy between women, relations between mothers and daughters, feminist sisterhood. And I think what I'm interested in doing is actually thinking of and I think this is related to the point you made when you started about sexuality versus identity, that the sense has been that all relations between women somehow relate to lesbianism, and lesbianism is not just a sexual identity and practice, but it is about how you feel about women in general as a woman. And in a way, I could make my point in the simplest way possible, I think, is saying that, gay people and lesbians have friends, and our friends are actually sometimes our lovers, but actually sometimes our friends are just our friends, and that we need a way to think in more refined, distinctive ways about the different kinds of social relationships we have, which isn't the same thing as saying they're completely unrelated and there's no communication between them. But so on the one hand, I'm saying, let's think about the erotic in much broader terms. And on the other hand, I'm saying, let's think about certain kinds of social relationships in much more specific terms without immediately connecting them to the sexual.
This is for Professor Marcus as well. Sorry, I hit you with another one.
Okay, talking warms me up, so let's go.
I was wondering, in either the Victorian era that you're talking about, or even in the current age, if it's a conscious decision by the state to ignore the erotic self, as you put it, because it's difficult for the state to control that intimately, or if there's something about female sexuality, as you're talking about it, that is just out of the concept of state agency to conceptualize and therefore have control over.
So the first point I'd make is that I think those are two very separate questions, and I'm going to answer briefly so that other people get a chance to know. It's okay. Female sexuality and the erotic self, I would see as very different terms, referring to very different things. Female sexuality was certainly ignored by the Victorian state. It's hard to know why. It's hard to explain absence or why something doesn't exist, but some obvious reasons. We had a very brief exchange about this is that the state was very interested in regulating reproduction, since sex between women doesn't produce legitimate or illegitimate offspring, not such a concern. Sex was defined as penetration, since the state could not really imagine most of the time what sex between women might consist of, or even though it often does involve penetration, it didn't count as sex. Why the erotic self isn't legislated is, I think, that it's often associated with privacy, and there's a problem for the liberal state with overly regulating what's perceived as private. And it's not seen as something that enters the realm of the law. Why or why not, I think I can't answer quickly enough, but it's a good question.
This is for Professor Kura. I'm trying to understand where you think this sort of bureaucratic confusion or discovery is going to head, and I'm trying to put this in context with Margot Canada's work in The Straight State and the discovery by draft boards of gender-ambiguous bodies during World War I, during the first sort of state discovery of the naked bodies of what we would now classify as transgendered people. Do you think that the TSA screeners are going to push for sort of more government regulation or definition of the identity of transgendered people, or do you think it'll involve less? I'm trying to understand where you think this will go.
Well, that's a very good question. One thing with the TSA screeners is they already do have some training with the gender stuff, because they have these long documents that, like, all those kind of WikiLeaks people put on the internet. Every time I download them, I get nervous. But they talk about the standing operating procedure. So when they actually do the enhanced genital pat-downs, they're instructed to do that, have an agent who is the same gender as the gender that the passenger presents himself in, do the pat-down. So they already are, doing a little bit of stuff around trying to sort out the contradictions. What I'm interested in doing, a lot of stuff in transgender social movement stuff and transgender rights stuff, is trying to figure out what the right definition should be and arguing about that. And like the National Center for Transgender Equality is very big on kind of pushing for one federal standard definition of gender. And I have two responses to that. First is like, hold up. Federalism is kind of terrible and bad, but in this particular situation, it might lead us in a better situation, that the confusion and contradictions and ambiguity might be better than having one hegemonic force of law sort of definition. The other thing I think we need to do, though, is working with alongside transgender rights lawyers and so on, and transgender rights activists, is a lot of folks kind of like have this very deeply sophisticated conceptualization of gender and the naturalization of power through sexual categories. And then the state just then they look at the state and it's going back to like, oh, the benevolent night watchman who's just a little bit muddled up and doesn't understand that gender norms have switched now. We don't have to segregate people. So I'm trying to get people to like not make normative questions about what the state ought to do. Well, obviously they should still do that, but also think about like, what is the state doing? Take the long historical view and don't kind of just naturalize the state as like the benevolent, stupid, but well-meaning liberal guardian of our bodies, but seeing like the investments it has in making these particular different kinds of decisions about when you get to be a man and when you get to be a woman, because those are about marriage and family and property and certain kind of constructions of race and nation and citizenship sometimes, and sometimes they're about security and territory, and it's in the state's interest to know, to have people walk around with pieces of identification that look like them, even though they, that's recognizing their new sexual assignment. So my basic thing is to like not actually look for a solution, but to look for what's going on, because I do see the attempts to kind of create some uniform gender rule to be very frightening. So.
Hi. It's a two-part question. The first part is also for Professor Cura. I'm from Spain, and there we initiated the Stop 2012 campaign about getting the gender dysphoria out of the DSM. So I love the expression bureaucratic dysphoria rather than gender dysphoria. And I know that in the States there is lots of debate because people feel that if we get it out, the sex change and the hormones wouldn't be covered by the health insurance. But apart from that, I wanted to know how very practical things like the TSA would be affected from the getting the gender dysphoria out of the DSM. And the second part of the question is directed at Professor Pellets and Najmabadi. You, Professor Najmabadi, talked about the DSM and how it affected Iran, but I also wanted to know if the DSM has influence in Southeast Asia, because it really affects Europe and in particular Spain. The psychiatric associations there draw all the definitions of pathologies from the American psychiatry associations. So I wanted to know what's the situations in different countries.
Okay, well, I'll just answer really briefly, but Spain always shows up as like really having lots of progressive policies around gender identity. But in terms of the DSM thing, it's part of the kind of medical expert discourse that legitimates a lot of transgender people's rights claims, and so it can be useful. But a state agency doesn't have to follow it. They can say, yeah, that's nice, but we don't have to follow it. So for corrections institutions, like they'll classify people as having gender identity disorder, but they won't follow any kind of treatment that the DSM would suggest. And the TSA also doesn't have to kind of invoke medical arguments in its kind of figuring out like whose body poses a threat and whose body doesn't pose a threat. In terms of the larger question of depathologizing gender identity disorder, that's like a really huge question that has a lot of really weird little regulatory stuff kind of wrapped into it. But it does kind of you have to think of the larger ways that all these different situations are implicated. So surgeons don't want to operate, without some kind of diagnosis, and then their insurance company doesn't want to sell them insurance if they're just kind of cutting into people without a diagnosis. It makes you have to make a lot of changes at once.
The question about Southeast Asia?
Yeah, just very briefly, the actual curriculum of psychology department at, say, Tehran Medical School or in the schools has integrated translation of a lot of this material into the training. But in fact, in the translation process, but even more so in the kind of clinical training that psychologists get who then work for the institute in the diagnostic process, a lot of things happen. In particular, the fact that both in language-wise, but in terms of the concept of sexuality, there is no distinction between gender and sexuality. Means a lot of categorizations just don't work. So is somebody homosexual, or is it transsexual, transgender, all of these things. And this also reflects itself in the way that people who come for these applications both recognize themselves and the stories they tell you. So one of the things that you see as a pattern, which would be very different in terms of pattern of translation of these concepts from U.S. text, is that both in the psychologist's understanding and in the transsexual, transgender people's understanding, there is most the narratives, for instance, starts with a gender discordant childhood, and then in adolescence, it immediately becomes an issue of sexuality and homosexual desire. There is just there is a complete switch in that, and so it produces a different set of symptoms that are being looked for, a completely different set of statements that are being made, so it becomes a very different story from the actual DSM text. That's just one example.
Yeah, following that.
Just a quick response to the Southeast Asia part. There's a tremendous variability in Southeast Asia between, say, southern Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, so it's difficult to make global statements, actually. But let's just say that the sexology came to Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia with a vengeance in the early 20th century, and a lot of it was adopted lock, stock, and barrel. If one looks in Malaysia, for example, where things, same-sex sexuality is heavily criminalized, which is not the case in Indonesia, for example, it really depends on which categories of acts and persons you're talking about. But generally speaking, they talk in terms of gendered persons rather than sexual orientations per se. But anyway, transsexuals tend to be seen as people born that way. They can't help it. We should help them. God gave them, this is from God. God asks us to give them a break, to put it badly. With respect to people who self-identify as gay, lesbian, or some variant of that, it's seen as a choice. and it's seen as Western decadence and perversion. It's sort of an inversion of the Asian values argument. But I can't do much better than that for the time being.
Yes, hello. I actually lived in Iran under the Shah, and I never heard about the transgender operations. I guess they were possibly still in the closet. But recently, I was recently back there on cultural trips, and sitting at dinner with the family whose father is a urologist, and they told me that this is what he does, and the government sponsors it, and the Mullah and Khomeini, I think it was, originally said it was all right, and they said, so yes, Dad does it, pass the salt. So how are those operations noticed in Iran? Are they noticed? How does the society react to them? And is it well known in the society?
Just small correction. It's actually not the case that there were no sex change operations during the old regime. The first reported sex change operation, actual sex change, not intersex operations, was reported in the press in 1973, but it was happening way before it. And in fact, at some point, the surgeons and medical professions became so anxious about it that the Medical Association of Iran discussed it and decided that they should urge surgeons not to do it, which between that date, which was 1977, and early 1980s, put a lot of people in terrible limbos. I'm not sure, in terms of the surgical operations, they're done in Tehran. There are several.
Oh, I realize that, but how are the people, in America, it's something that is not openly discussed as much, except in, meetings like this, but it's looked upon a little bit differently. And is it open in Iran?
It's very open, and there was, in fact, a period in which it got intense media coverage, but the kind of announcement that I started my talk with, it was in the press. It's reported.
And was the reaction of the society positive or negative?
That's a much more complicated issue.
Thank you.
Okay. One more. I'm sad to say, you get the point for you.
For you, Taffy.
But for everyone else, it's a sad occasion. You get the last question.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Doniger. I was wondering, you said very briefly during your talk that the idea that the linga is abstract is somehow associated with Hindu nationalism, and I was just wondering, anything you could say to flesh that out a little more? How did they use that idea, or how does that fit in with their ideology in general?
To be brief, Hindu nationalism in general is advancing a particular form of Hinduism which was invented in the 19th century, largely in Bengal, which is largely philosophical. I sympathized with Professor Mill's statement that philosophers are not supposed to have bodies and so forth, and that certainly has been the Indian tradition, that it is the nationalist position that Hinduism is a philosophical system and doesn't have a body. So to the extent that modern nationalism is advancing that particular form of Hinduism, there's a lot of sexual censorship, and there's a lot of disavowal of other forms of Hinduism which are in fact sexual. So it is partly the British influence, but it is also the British influence which produced that kind of Hinduism, which was taken up by Hindu nationalists and is now part of the BJP agenda in particular, that denies any sexual aspect to the religion at all, including the sexual aspect of the lingam.
So I'd like to thank all of you for sitting around, and also the speakers for giving us a very entertaining and thought-provoking afternoon, and I think we should give it up to them.